Okay. This is a test for the Holocaust lecture series.
Look at the lectures that you missed. The other thing I want to call your attention to is that the commemoration of the Holocaust observed. There'll be one in San Francisco on May 1st at 7 p.m. in San Francisco at Congregation Emmanuel. In Sonoma County, we will have a commemoration on campus on Sunday afternoon, 2 p.m. On the program will be Robert Ross, who is a professor with the Graduate Theological Union. It'll be a rather interesting program, and you're all attend. There's no charge.
May 30th.
May 30th.
May 30th.
No, April 30th. April 30th. And May 1st is the date of the one in San Francisco.
I just have one announcement. We want to show a video that we've just gotten. It's called "The Holocaust as Seen Through the Eyes of a Survivor." Do I need to put this? Okay, just an announcement, Bernard. Anyway, it's called "The Holocaust as Seen Through the Eyes of a Survivor." It's a 40-minute video. I'll be handing around a flyer about it for those of you who are interested. In addition, I will send this bulletin board around, clipboard, excuse me, around, that has a sign-up on it. And if you could please put your preference for time. I'm going to try to show it 1 of 3 times next Tuesday. And I'm trying to cluster it around the Holocaust lecture series. So it could be at 12 noon, at 3 o'clock, or at 6 o'clock. And we'll just see how many people sign up and at what times. We'll probably be showing it in one of the library video rooms. It's pretty similar in story. He's now 67 years old, the man, David Bergman, who did the video. And his story is real similar, in fact, to Dr. Steiner's, Dr. Benkos, and Bernard Offen's, in that he was a young boy when he went into the camps. And I guess he was in actually a couple of same places that Dr. Steiner was. And also for those of you who are interested in teaching, it's a real good educational video because it defines a lot of the terms of the Holocaust very briefly, and it's not particularly gruesome. It relies a lot on art of the Holocaust, which is a much gentler way to acquaint yourself, for instance, if you're a high school student or someone new to the subject. So I'll pass these around.
I just wanted to make clear to you that I've got all the papers which you have handed to me, which are graded and corrected and responses. So anyone who has given me papers can get them back at any time today. And it's now time for me to introduce our speaker. Now, we've had a small mishap, an accident. Professor Alderman has had an accident and is not going to be here today. And he has asked Professor Bernd Jäger to read the manuscript which he has prepared for this lecture to present to us. Professor Alderman, as you know, is an author, well-published, an expert on Nietzsche, and has worked very diligently on his presentation today, and he was very sorry that he can't come personally to present it and respond to questions which I'm sure will follow after the presentation. So Professor Jäger was kind enough to assume the responsibility for reading. He's not responsible for what he's going to read, and I don't know that he can respond to questions, but I'm sure that he'll try, and since he acquainted himself with the lecture by virtue of preparing for it when he's going to read it, before he's going to read it. So I'll present to you Professor Bernd Jäger from the Department of Psychology.
I'll just hang this around. Oh, this goes like this, I suppose. Well, I'm doing this not very efficiently. Okay. Okay, good, thanks. All right. Yeah, I'll read to you the paper and of my friend Harold. Let me just say briefly that we've always had great sympathy for each other's points of view. We've very much studied similar authors, same authors. So I might be able, after read the paper, to guess what Harold would say if you asked him a particular question. So I'll just do my best about that. The paper is entitled "The Holocaust and Memorial Implications." I am invited here to speak about the Holocaust by a group of people who generally know more about the Holocaust than I do, two of whom are indeed survivors. Now, it seems to me that there are three kinds of people who might decently and responsibly accept such an invitation. First of all, Holocaust scholars. Second, and others with important personal stories to tell. And number three, someone who wanted to learn something and not being sure whether it was a wise or foolish thing to do, seized the occasion. I fall into this latter group. So for the moment, let me admit to a surrealistic sense of responsibility about being here. That is, I have a sense that I ought to keep quiet, say nothing. That is, I feel an unrealistic desire to flee from this room, leaving you here alone so I can talk about sensible human things. Things like baseball or geometry, movies, what's for dinner, almost anything else. Indeed, as I stand before you, I have an uncanny desire to become a Zen Buddhist monk, to take a vow of silence. And this is not, I want you to know, a typical frame of mind for me. I love to talk about almost anything, a good witticism, a novel, film scripts, philosophy, politics, editorials that make me fume and howl. Just saying these names gives me a certain assurance, makes me feel a little more at home. Editorial, novel, see how solid these words are? Yet it seems to me there is very little anyone can say about the Holocaust, least of all me. Nothing that touches it fairly and honestly, bringing it home to language where we can dwell with it, chew it over, speak its true name. The Holocaust stops the tongue, makes one mute, it seals the lips. It haunts language from its other, darker side. It is the thing that lurks at the boundary of intelligibility. It scares children around campfires, makes cowards of us all. It makes me feel inadequate precisely because it eludes language, because it resists intelligibility. And yet, the Holocaust, like a ghost that is used to having its way, cries out to have the power of fixing us in our place with a name. Much better the age of the computer than the age of the Holocaust. But I do not think that is how it will be. Ours is, I think, to be a different fate. The first implication of the Holocaust, that is, its first challenge to us, is a challenge to language and to naming. The Holocaust is a provocation to say what my century, I say the few words that I can get hold of. Like you, I'm bewildered by my time. It is thus as a bewildered man that I say the name Holocaust, remembering even as I say it that others have told me I must say Shoah instead. But names are like fates. When they're given, all we can do is live with them. And so what happened in Europe between 1933 and 1945 is the Holocaust, a burnt offering made by the crazy religion of Nazism, a firestorm of annihilation and death. It is then the Holocaust whose implications I, both personally and philosophically, trace out with you today. Though truth be told, for me, there is little distinction between the personal and the philosophical. And you must keep this in mind as I take you through a set of anecdotes from which, like Aesop, I shall try to draw a few philosophical lessons. But what is warranted for thinking, what is my warrant for thinking that my personal experience has anything to do with the implications of the Holocaust? Excuse me. You know, with the pollen and the antihistamines and that reading, so you need to, etc. So, Harold is saying he's going to first tell us a few of his stories, and then, but what does these stories have to do with the implications of the Holocaust? After all, I was not there, either as a victim or as a criminal. And therein lies exactly of these few personal reflections on the implications of the Holocaust. Most of you were not there either, and it is to you that these words are spoken. The Holocaust is in my memory like it is in most of yours, as an eruption, a dark shadow, or some vague, indistinct and terrible thing that comes upon you when you least expect it. For me, there have been several such monstrous epiphanies, moments when the suddenly remembered fact of the Holocaust overwhelmed me, and, as honestly as I can, to relate them to you. As banal as they may seem, these things actually happened. They are not made up, far-fetched, nor are they far-fetched examples that philosophy teachers love to construct. Rather, they are signs of the way in which, in the midst of perfectly wonderful quotidian days, the Holocaust makes its implication existentially known to us. In January 1962, I graduated from the University of Florida with a BA in philosophy. Not knowing what I wanted to do, I took a job in Washington, which is, as far as I can tell, a refuge of a great many other unemployed, directionless people. One day, in late April, I was walking down P Street towards Georgetown. It was a wondrous day. The sun was shining, the heat on the skin a blessing after so many grey, wintry Washington days. There were even real cherry on the trees. Everything was green and new. Dogs barked. Girls lay in the park, cooking themselves deliciously, though to me they already seemed quite well done. My coat hooked over my thumb hung down my back, a useless artifact of harder wintry times. About 3 or 4 blocks over the P Street Bridge, I stopped into a small corner store for an ice cream. Inside the dark store, the temperature dropped, and I remember quite clearly my handkerchief to wipe the sweat of my forehead. A small man I took to be in his 60s sat behind the counter, piled with magazines and sundries. I hesitated for a minute, expecting him to say something traditional like, "May I help you?" But he just kept staring off into some unoccupied space into which only he could see. Shrugging, I ignored him. He was just one more rude old man. So what? For an instant I thought of leaving, but it was spring, and I was hot and wanted something cool to eat or drink. Anyway, why let a great day be ruined by one uncommunicative old man? I spotted the freezer at the back of the store, got myself a dreamsicle in memory of my Florida boyhood days, and came back up front to pay for it. I reached into my pocket for a genuine silver quarter and gave it to the man. So far, neither of us had said a word. Taking my money, he put the old-fashioned cash register, taking out a nickel and a dime, and handing them to me with his left hand. As he stuck out his hand, his sleeve pulled up, and on the inside of his forearm there was a set of small, tattooed numbers. I remember a 1 and a 0, and especially the peculiar German shape of the 1. It seemed to me there were 2 other numbers, one of them a 7, but there may have been well more than that. My eyes widened. I wanted to say something, wanted him to know I knew the meaning of the numbers. But he was wiser than me. He knew there was nothing to say. Knew that have a nice day wasn't enough and hardly anything else was possible. Knew that I couldn't say how was Dachau or Treblinka or Buchenwald or whatever other hellhole he had lost part of his life in. There was no bridge between us in common speech, and I know no other words, nor did he. For me he was what Heidegger calls an intrusion into everydayness. He tore open the fabric of my everyday world. He was a riddle for which I had no response at all. Over the next 5 months, I was in and out of the store at least a dozen times. P Street was a great walking street in those days. Hopefully it still is. Although the man began to recognize me, all we ever said to each other, "Thank you and you're welcome." I bought my popsicle. He gave me change. So it went. That was our bond of everydayness. But the truth is, he remains a mystery to me. And I still don't know how he kept on with the sensible things of everyday life, making change, getting out of bed, having dinner. After all, his life had once and for all been utterly rent by the incomprehensible other to everydayness. I concluded, and he seemed to concur, that for him there was no way back to the sustaining bonds of the plain and ordinary things of a human life. His experience forever redrew for the rest of us the now more insecure bonds of the everyday world. While the solidity of work well done, the simple hand clasp or the greeting of a friend ever again have quite the same meaning, can we ever be quite sure of memory? The second Holocaust epiphany took place one evening after dinner at a friend's house in New Orleans. And like the first one, it was totally unexpected. I don't know, perhaps all epiphanies are like that. In any event, after dinner, my hostess had gotten out an old family album. I had cringed. Hardly anything is more excruciating than having someone lead you on a tour of their childhood. Frida, that is not her real name, was showing us some pictures of her childhood when she came across one of herself. A typically blonde-haired, blue-eyed Bavarian dressed in lederhosen, a swastika hanging proudly around her neck. A childishly innocent token of some time, of some monstrous time. Except, she saw the look on my face. I was terminally uncomfortable. Finally, I had to say it. Had to say what she knew I was thinking. But you were Jewish, I said, looking at the woman. I had always considered the typical Southern Jewish princess, strong a Southern accent, part Scarlett O'Hara, quiet but highly verbal. Her husband, I knew, was Jewish. Yes, she said in response to my question, I am, but I didn't know it until I was 6. I waited for several beats until she went on with the story. My parents were taken away to the camps. I was raised by a German family during the war. After the war, when my mother came to get me, the Germans, the people I thought were my mother and father, they refused to let me go. And I didn't want to go, but the Americans decided I had to. We stared at each other a moment. I didn't know what to say, but I remember thinking, maybe it wasn't so bad for them after all. All that Holocaust stuff sounded for an instant like tales made up by grandfathers around evening campfire. After all, I had the evidence in hand. At considerable risk to themselves, Germans saved little Jewish girls. Sure, it must have been bad, I thought, but the Jews are exaggerating. This momentary conclusion, sad to say, is one I've learned that a lot of people insist is correct. The moral of this little epiphany is twofold. The first part of it deals with my Holocaust denial, based only on the thin photographic evidence of one happy, small, blonde-haired girl who had once thought she was German and who, truth to be known, in many senses really was. There is this monstrous thing I had tried to conjure away with nothing more than a bit of silver nitrate emulsion in a photograph album. After all, I liked Germans, depended on them in many ways for my studies. Heidegger, Nietzsche. Considered even then that one of Beethoven's Razumovsky quartets was worth 200 or 300 years of other human achievements. So I wanted to exculpate things German, was in fact tired of hearing about the Holocaust, was particularly irritated with it intruding into my evening of gumbo and good conversation. So memory, which in a sense is always Orwellian, did its trick for me. It put a gloss on things, put the evening back under my control. Things weren't so bad after all under the Third Reich. All those Jews protected by German foster parents, or so I thought, at least for a moment. This, then, is the first moral of my second anecdote. Memory is not a trustworthy guide. It is too willing to accept present need as a master in its reconstruction of the past. Memory, the Holocaust teaches us, needs to be trained, needs the discipline of work. If it is to yield something more than fairy tales, suitable only for ideologues and politicians. The Holocaust is a challenge to memory, to our own humanity as bearers of what came before us. It issues a demand that we, in part, are meeting here today. The second moral I want to draw from this anecdote of a long ago dinner derives from something Thomas Wolfe once wrote in one of his most quoted titles of one of the least read novels of the 20th century American literature, Can't Go Home Again. So now memory goes back to Frida, her photograph album, her 2 daughters, now grown and in college. I see her turning the pages of a much older photograph album, looking for something foundational on which she can anchor all that has happened to her here in America. But it isn't there. She turns the pages back and forth. The little girl in the lederhosen smiles out at her. In my own family album, things are a little less certain. There is my father smiling out at me in his 14-year-old boy's football uniform. Is he real? And if he's not, am I? Memory, then, in both the public sense out of which we build an understanding of the 20th century history and its root sense as a project of personal retrieval, is challenged by the Holocaust. Nietzsche and Freud initiated this. This is, in fact, my favorite German city. In most people's minds, Munich probably first connotes beer halls. Then right after that, I think it is most probably associated with Oktoberfest and Hitler. Indeed, Munich Oktoberfest beer halls and Hitler are probably forged as part of modern memory into one unassailable unit that none of us can free associate away. Nonetheless, I like Munich. I like walking in Schwabing, going into bookstores in the University District. I like the Alte Pinakothek, one of my favorite museums. I like the beer halls, their crowds, their beer, their sausage, their genuine Gemütlichkeit, something Arthur Frommer did not invent for American tourists. I first came into Munich on New Year's Eve 1969. Just 2 months earlier, I had finished and defended my dissertation on Martin Heidegger at Tulane University. I arrived on the train from Paris about an hour before midnight. Exhausted, hungry, we struggled with our heavy suitcases through the main lobby of the train station. And there, blinking in bright red neon, was the word Andenken on the wall just in front of us. Now, in Heidegger's work, the word Andenken looms rather large. For me, it meant only what Heidegger said it meant, a kind of thinking that is historical, a gentle retrieving thinking, in which one gets back to the origin of things. Seeing that special word blinking there was rather like being an illiterate Indian mystic going to Delhi, only to find the word Om blinking brightly inside the train station. Such an omen. And boy, did I need a dictionary of non-Heideggerian German. After all, Andenken is the ordinary German word that means souvenir. Anyway, after hurriedly depositing our luggage in a locker, we ran down Neuhauser Strasse to find a Gasthaus, one German word that had no special Heideggerian significance. I promised something solid: food, beer, companionship, warmth. Well, we got what we were looking for, and then a good night's sleep. Next morning, we went back to the train station to continue to Ebersberg, a place where we both were going to study German. This is then the background to my next Holocaust epiphany. A month after arrival in Ebersberg, we went back to Munich for 2 days. One afternoon, while walking to cross the street at a traffic circle near the Alte Pinakothek, I looked up, just as I stepped into the busy street, to see a bus bearing down on me at a rather rapid rate. Sign on a bus is and should be. We read them all the time: Santa Rosa, San Francisco, Petaluma, the names of solid, innocent places in which people live out their lives in work and dreams. But Dachau, the word itself, as a name, cannot be innocent ever again. Seeing that word on a bus was exactly like seeing the words Hell, Seventh Ring on a bus one is about to board. It resonates in language like the word Gulag or Hiroshima or Pearl Harbor. For the first time in my life, I think I knew what the word stunned meant. A sudden blow that deprives one of consciousness. Until this day, I still don't know how anyone could get on that bus. I must also tell you that one of the reasons I was stunned was that I did not, at that time, know where Dachau was. I assumed it was in Poland, perhaps another form of Holocaust denial, for it is almost certain that at some time or other I had read that Dachau was in Germany. To find it there so close to hand, so easily in everyday world, took away all my points of reference, rendered me blind in my own space and time. But that is exactly how I think things are with the death camps of the Holocaust. They break out at you right in the middle of the most ordinary situations, coming rushing down on you, demanding to be remembered. And when they do, you'd best stop and pay attention to them. The death camps are, after all, like so many huge social masses, black holes whose gravitational attraction will, one day or the other, have their way with us. My last two Holocaust epiphanies also take place in Europe, one in France and one in Germany. I shall deal with the German one last, though it in fact occurred first, and I shall do this because it's a better transition to the more abstract part of my presentation about the implication of the Holocaust. Along the banks of the River Seine in Paris, just behind Notre Dame, on the Isle of France, the Ile-de-France, there is a piece of sculpture called Monument to the Deportees. It is, as you may know or guess, a memorial for those 200,000 Jews who were sent to the slave labor camps and extermination camps, only 3% of whom survived. The monument itself is somewhat like a maze. One walks down into it from the banks of the river, down into an abstract reconstruction of a moment in one of the camps, down into a crypt. The city of Paris, having disappeared, is reflected only in the thousands of shards of glass embedded in the walls of the narrow corridors. Everything is still, deathly. The stone walls hem one in, take away any possibility of free movement. One enters the monument as one entered the camps. All movement directed towards a single outcome, all choice taken away. On the walls, various poems, various fragments of language try to capture in metal the weight of the death camps, a weight that seems to elude the Morse or printed word. Moving along the narrow passages, among the anguished histories captured forever in the stone walls, one is literally caught in a web of words, of haunted names, curses, prayers, agonized shrieks. Think of Edvard Munch, Der Schrei. Hear the agony in that voice multiplied by 1,000. Place yourself in the midst of all that crying. Think of hell. Then imagine barbed wire caught in the solidity of stone, something light and deadly captured in the permanent thickness of the sculptured stone, in the capturing becoming as heavy and implacable as the time and place for which it is an Andenken, a reminder for the innocent and the guilty alike. Now tell me that, being sane and rational, you can walk into the monument to the deportees as if it were nothing more than a work of art on the banks of the river. I couldn't. I can't go on in here, I said to my wife, hanging on the threshold, being caught at the opening into a world I could not imagine. She saw the look on my face and let me be. I hovered, temporized, hesitated, then finally did what I was supposed to do. I entered the only haunted place I ever know. Somehow there is on the bank of the Seine a work of art that has captured the essence of the terror in the camps, evoked it once and for all, made its horror unavoidable in a way that leaves no room for after-dinner evasions or arithmetical equivocations. What happened in the Nazi death camps cannot be exorcised. The stone of the monument of the deportees gives the Holocaust weight and solidity, makes it a palpable, real thing of our century. It is a bulwark against the evasion of memory. There, amidst the cramped corridors of the work of art, the death camps are with us, implacable. One reads the exit line, forgive, but do not forget, and wonders if such heroic forgiveness is possible, understands those who cannot forgive, and is haunted by the death camp graffiti of Andreas Rapport, who just before his death in Auschwitz wrote in his own blood his name, Andreas Rapport, I lived 16 years. It is the epigraph of the death camp, a single transfiguring line that captures the evil absurdity of Auschwitz. A boy with his own blood marks his history. There's a crucial difference between the Holocaust epiphany and the others I've related to you. It also differs in the same way from the next one. This memorial encounter on the banks of the Seine was freely chosen, The work of art in Paris is set aside to provoke the resistant memory, to make it see what it might well prefer blindness, to make it hear when it might well prefer deaf. The monument to the deportees does what Heidegger says all great works of art do. It organizes our experience around a crucial moment of human history, dividing the world into the sacred and the profane, making us call into question our certainties about the everyday world we so take for granted. My next and last Holocaust anecdote constitutes a bridge between these personal reminiscences of particular concrete moments in my own history and the explicitly philosophical implications I wish to draw from them. As I hope you will see, these reminiscences themselves are the fruit of these implications. This last anecdote retrieves a moment of conversation between two men on a train and thus takes us back to the domain of philosophy, the spoken word. It also poses one of the key philosophical questions this discussion means to raise, the question about the tyranny abstract. And so, my last anecdote. A man sits across from you in the compartment of a German train. In the hours since you left Munich, you have exchanged the sort of pleasantries one exchanges with strangers on a train. Hello, good day, are you American? Where are you from? And so on. His wife nods and smiles. Your wife eventually curls up in the corner and goes to sleep, possessing the traveler's greatest natural talent, the ability to sleep anywhere, anytime, any condition. After a while, everyone settles into their own private spaces, into reading, snacking, into gazing out the window as the landscape flashes by. I smoke a pipe. The man reads Der Stern. The train rolls on, its lulling, clacking tempo soothing us all. Then, as the journey grows longer, and we are only minutes away from our destination, it is apparent the man wants to open the conversation again. Perhaps it is because he senses the imminent end to our sealed between cities existence on the train. We're getting close to Zurich, and the peculiar intimate anonymity of train travel must be brought to an end as we once again approach a human community where people simply don't sit together for 3 hours without talking. We speak of everyday things. He tells me he owns a pension in Munich. In fact, 2 of them. He gives me a business. Tell him I'm in Germany working on a book on Nietzsche. He and his wife exchange a glance. Then I mention I've also written several articles on another German philosopher named Heidegger. He hasn't heard of him, though he says that before the war he took a course in philosophy. I smile, feeling the sort of awkwardness one feels when talking about the things one does best with someone who doesn't know or care about them. He asks me something about Nietzsche. I don't remember what. He and his wife exchange glances again. As the train begins to slow, my wife wakes up. The man obviously wants to say something, but isn't sure he should. He and his wife have a quick exchange of glances in dialect that I don't understand. It sounds like German, but it is as close as I can get. As we begin to move into the outskirts of Zurich, he says something to me in halting English. What he says is mostly garbled English words, German sentences, but both my wife and a certain ominous drift. I shrug my incomprehension. The man becomes agitated, seems to be rehearsing a speech, lapses into silence. Then, once again, in now well-rehearsed, mostly grammatical English, he very clearly says, "You Americans think you're so high, but just wait, you'll see. What we did to the Jews is nothing compared to what you are going to do to die Schwarzen." Dumbfounded. To black people. Schwarzen for the black people. What you're going to do for the black people. So I'll read it again. But you just wait. What we did to the Jews is nothing compared to what you are going to do to die Schwarzen. I'm quite dumbfounded. Having heard his say, the man pulls sternly back into himself, crossing his arms smugly across his chest. His wife stares out the window, refuses to catch my eye. The train comes to a jolting, clanking stop. The German man and his wife grab their single bag and leave without saying anything. It's clear that what he said to me has been on his chest for a long time. Finally, he's gotten rid of it, there in the intimate anonymity of the train. He's had his cathartic moment at my expense. I whispered to my wife, "Did you hear that?" As we grab our things and follow the couple off the train, she... Over the years, I've wondered about what the man said to us that day. And this feels like the right occasion to make sense of his blurted confession, his well-timed self-aborted attempt at justification. This story also brings to an end the anecdotal part of my remarks. From here on, we slog briefly through the thicket of Heideggerian insight as I try, somewhat more explicitly, to draw out the philosophical implications of the Holocaust. I try to argue that the primary philosophical implication of the Holocaust is the moral need to recover the concrete everydayness of our worldly lives from the abstract morass of what Heidegger calls das Gestell. I shall read this once more. As I try to argue that the primary philosophical implication of the Holocaust is the moral need to recover concrete everydayness of our worldly lives from the morass of what Heidegger calls das Gestell. Das Gestell means a framework, support, pedestal, crucible, etc. Das Gestell. Thus we have a justification for my anecdotes which themselves deal with the concrete and the particular. But before I go on with this, I want to express one regret about my conversation with the German stranger. I wish I had saved his business card. I would like to have been able to track down his name in the register of Nuremberg or Frankfurt Auschwitz trials. I would like to know who it was I traveled with on a train in Germany 15 years ago. About the anonymous man's comment, I want first of all to say this. I think he's clearly wrong about his prediction of a coming American Holocaust. In fact, I find the idea preposterous, but that doesn't touch the heart of the matter. For the man had gotten one thing right that strikes right at the heart of the matter I'm displaying. His blurted and unintentional confession points directly at something that must be remembered in all discussions of the Holocaust. And that is that it is deadly stupid to hypothesize the Holocaust as something that happened long ago and far away, something in which all Germans were criminals and all Jews victims forever and ever, as in some storybook fairy tale that can never again recur, and which you and I can read with innocent detachment. It is deadly stupid to think of Hitler, Nazi, that if we hold the Germans collectively guilty, we are simply reinventing Nazism. As with Bettelheim, I insist that the notion of collective guilt is itself a totalitarian notion. One, as I shall argue, that is a product of what Heidegger calls das Gestell. Were there guilty Germans? You bet there were. Were there gypsy, political, Polish, Czech and others in addition to the Jews? Indeed, we all know that. That's one reason we're here, to understand the process of victimization generated by Nazism. Are we fortunate to have the Jews keep their story of Holocaust alive? Indeed we are. The world owes Judaism a deep debt for its insistent retelling of the tale of the Holocaust. The problem lies not in that the Jews keep telling a story the modern apparently no longer wants to hear, but that other victims of other Holocausts do not have a tradition of witnessing as old and wise as that of Judaism. Where are the witnesses for Cambodia, Biafra, Burundi, Soviet Gulag? So what then is my point about hypothesizing Nazism as something that took place long ago and that is now objectively available for scientific study? Simply this: if we displace evil to a long ago demonic time, we may miss it when it recurs in our own experience, may not see its first seeds when its ugly tendrils begin to blossom again. May faithfully exempt ourselves from the same temptations faced the Germans between 1933 and 1945. May once again find ourselves seduced by the theoretical Gestell of some abstract ideology that yields a warrant for the destruction of some other people's everyday way of life. So where am I going with this condemnation of the abstract? Let me begin with a brief discussion of what Heidegger means by the concept of das Gestell. In the first place, in ordinary German, the word Gestell means framework or rack. Heidegger naturally, as with all philosophers, especially German ones, turns the word onto a technical concept. In Heidegger's sense, das Gestell is a framework in all Western experience, a framework in terms of which the user of the framework gains the apparent power to control his own destiny. In terms of this enframing, empowering Gestell, every human activity is judged as to whether or not it impedes or enhances its approach. make an editorial comment. Das Gestell can somehow be understood somehow as a kind of a framework within which we place our thoughts, our observations, within which take place our everyday conversations. It's all the time. Yes? Oh, all right. Das Gestell. You know, that's obviously the stellen, placing something, a framework. Okay. Okay. So in terms of this enframing, empowering Gestell, every human activity is judged as to whether or not it impedes or enhances. Okay, so whether it belongs to this Gestell or whether it doesn't. Whether it impedes or an approach to the largely unarticulated goal of gaining ultimate power over everything. That would be the Gestell, the goal of gaining absolute power over everything. Thus, das Gestell might be understood as a set of metaphysical blinders that give us all a terminal case of tunnel vision. What das Gestell does not recognize does not exist. What das Gestell recognizes is alone real and worthy of attention. In this sense, the enframing Gestell is the underlying working principle of totalitarianism. It is in terms of das Gestell that any totalizing interpretation of human experience is made possible. Attention to the specifics of the origin of our contemporary Gestalt will, I hope, make all this quite clear. As with things philosophical, the origins of das Gestell go back clearly and unequivocally, eliminate a rational error through the practice of dialectic, his technique. A fateful axiom is laid down for Western thinking. What this axiom leads to is the 20th century attempt to objectivize every aspect of human experience. Thus the belief that everything, both human and non-human things, can be subject to the objective analysis of scientific method. From Heidegger's perspective, what remains hidden from the 20th century preoccupation with quote-unquote objectivity, in both its informed scientific and its deformed Nazi version, is that the concept of objectivity itself has a history, and that this history began in Plato. Very briefly then, the objectifying practices of das Gestell begin with Plato's first attempt to eliminate the ambiguity of everyday speech as a remnant of language. What Plato, long before Descartes, clearly implied was that if something cannot be said unequivocally, then it isn't worth saying. Thus this first major maneuver of Plato's, really an act of concealment, hides a massive presupposition in the heart of our thinking about being technical and being objective. Giving an examination of this presupposition, we can hopefully be led to see the limits of our attempt to be objective. In Heidegger's view, the Western pell-mell stampede towards the ideal of our Gestell, that is the totalizing framework, does nothing less than conceal its dependency on its own history. After all, if the standard of objectivity can be seen to have a history, then it would be possible to rethink it, both in its power and its limitations. The power of the standard of objectivity within the framework of das Gestell is utterly dependent upon hiding its own history, like nature. Huh? The Gestell, after all, is not an hypothesis. It is the absolute truth about everything. In Heidegger's view, the history of the development of das Gestell goes something like this. First, Plato struggles with the hope of an ideal objectivity free of the bothersome details of particular things. Then Descartes makes his ideal of objectivity a taken-for-granted mandate of thinking by claiming that something is true if and only if it cannot be doubted. Then, in Newton and others, the language of mathematics, with its ideal of formal rigor, is put in its place as just the sort of language appropriate to a totalizing objective framework. Then, on the basis of the language of mathematics, the modern sciences flourish as the appropriate caretaker of the total language of a spurious objectivity. Once the sciences are institutionalized as social practices, the nature of the ideal of objectivity that they have taken for granted is by then well hidden and can no longer be opened up for examination. What starts out as a possibility of thinking that in Plato's work is bounded by other dialectically open directions, poetry, myth, everyday speech, becomes a taken for granted self-justifying absolute in our contemporary Gestell. Reality can only be described in terms of the technical apparatus available in our cultural framework, Gestell, whatever those apparatuses may be in one or the other versions of das Gestell. What eludes description in terms of the language of das Gestell is not serious, not worthy of consideration. Thus, for example, I look up at a cloud and I see a horse's head figure. Describe. My 11-year-old looks at me impatiently and says, "No, Dad, that's just a cumulus cloud. There's probably going to be clear weather." You see, he's got the totalizing language. I'm just making a mistake. Now, my point here is not that my metaphorical language that describes horses' heads in clouds is a better language than the one my son has learned in school. It's rather that my way of speaking welcomes room for his way of speaking. Totalizing language cannot do that, cannot reciprocate this openness. Everyday language can include scientific language, but scientific language cannot include everyday language. Well, what does this brief history of the development of das Gestell have to do with the Holocaust? You may be impatiently asking. Everything, I answer. The Nazism is just one variation of the totalizing theme of das Gestell. Let me put it this way. You at this point are probably well acquainted with the social and historical conditions that lie behind the rise of Nazism. You may also be acquainted with Houston Stewart Chamberlain's Foundation of the 19th Century, G.A. de Gobineau, The Inequality of the Human Races, Alfred Rosenberg's The Myth of the 20th Century, and I'm sure you're well acquainted with the fact that Hitler himself wrote an intellectualizing worldview. The racial doctrines that underlie Nazism and lead directly to the Holocaust are products of this Gestell. In the Nazi version of Gestell, the Jews and other so-called inferior races, in a massive assault on everyday traditional ways of discussing fellow human beings, are pushed out of the framework of real human beings. Subsequent to this violent exclusion from language, a secondary language, the Nazism, is developed to seal the fate of the people so excluded. Thus, in the Nazi form of das Gestell, the Jews are viewed as Untermenschen, subhuman, as Schädling, as and given the purview of the Nazi Gestell, all that is required to solve the Jewish problem is the rigorous application of its racial techniques. This all leads rather inevitably to Auschwitz and Zyklon B, to the final solution of the Jewish problem. It is all a matter of engineering. Such is the power of das Gestell, that it permits one human being to deny the humanity of another. By denying the legitimacy of the language that carries that message and substituting for it the language that excludes it. To illustrate what I'm talking about here with an analogy, let us imagine an enormous valley in the American West, not a hard thing to do. Let us imagine a group of Navajo Indians whose families have walked the valleys for generations. Then into this narrative, let us introduce an engineer in search of coal or oil. For the Navajo, the valley is a rich and complex place in which he can read the history of his people. He refuses to simplify it, refuses to reduce it to he can solve. It is the valley's very richness that he cherishes. It is its sturdiness, its ambiguity, its granting of succor for his sheep, its source of water, its place as a refuge for the old ones, its very grandeur that creates a sense of awe about both the valley and his own mortality. The valley is complex, ambiguous. It threatens death, it offers life. Never does the Navajo has a language in which he can banish from the valley all that is not useful to him. His is not the language of our Gestell. His everyday speech requires that he admit the resonances of ambiguity in his sayings about the valley, demands that he acknowledge that the valley was something before he came on the scene and will be so long after he is gone. In contrast, for the engineer, the valley is reduced to a set of technical challenges. The engineer knows what is real in it, oil or coal, and everything else in the valley is but an obstacle to this getting what we want. See that great butt over there? It's the way of the haulers. See that river? We can use it to generate hydroelectric power. Thus, in the engineer's totalizing language, everything useless in the valley disappears under the relentless power of his Gestell framework. The valley is objectively only what the engineer says it is, and he has a lot of machines through which he can express the power of his Gestell and prove. Behind the ideal of our Gestell, then, with its spurious claims to neutral objectivity, there lies the paradoxical foundation of a radical subjectivism. The valley is what the engineer says it is because his powerful way of speaking about it can dominate all others, can quickly sort out the useful and the useless. In an absolutely identical way, the Nazis' regard of the Jews and other so-called undesirables is strictly analogous to the engineer's regard of the valley. They are simply impediments to be gotten rid of so the 1,000-year Reich can begin, so the oil can flow. The engineer is in the valley. The Nazis and the 20th century totalitarians are terrorists in the heart of the human community. To move towards the completion of the tale of this Gestalt, totalitarianism and Auschwitz, let me return for a minute to the works of Plato in order to suggest what is necessary as a bulwark against the totalizing language of das Gestell. That is, let me make this return so we can retrieve from the beginning of the Western what is necessary to save ourselves. That is, so we can perhaps save the human community from any renaissance of the malevolence of das Gestell. In Plato's Republic and others of his works, Plato carefully balances his search for the purifying language of dialectic with a constant return to the language and textures of myth, poetry, and metaphor, languages which do not attempt the totalization of experience, languages which, in their very tentativeness, are hesitant about what they claim, and that willingly celebrate the penumbra of mystery that always surrounds any merely human mode of speaking. It is to these prior early forms of discourse that are nurtured in everyday speech that we must turn if we are to avoid the depredations of totalitarianism. Thus, when Plato hedges his best dialectical guesses about the nature of that absolute describes in his theory of forms, he is in effect recognizing the tentativeness of all human discourse and not merely confessing he hasn't quite got it right yet. Plato was wiser than Descartes, and we in the 20th century, who are heir to both Plato's dreams and nightmares, must recover what is wisest in his work. But what exactly does all this mean in terms of the philosophical implications of the Holocaust? Well, first of all, it means that the Holocaust is the premier challenge to the nature of moral discourse in our time. It is the paradigm of human savagery, a paradigm which demands careful study so that we might rethink what the purposes of moral language are. Without careful attention to the events of the Holocaust, no one has a right to talk about the nature of morality, about the nature of moral theory, about human rights. For in the occurrence of the Holocaust, all the moral structures that bound us together as a human community were systematically destroyed. It is then to a study of the logic of Nazi version of Gestell that we must turn if we are to be serious about the phrase, never again. If we actually mean that there will be no more Auschwitz, Treblinkas, and Dachau, whatever their names, and whatever they either gave birth to their monstrous forms, for the great and seductive power of das Gestell is that it does not allow us to see what it does not want us to see. The engineer cannot see the beauty of the butt in the Navajo Valley. It is only an impediment to his technical project. Or at least he cannot take his perception of the beauty of the valley on equal terms with his technical evaluation of it. One is serious, the other is frivolous. The Nazi cannot see the human beauty of a young boy's being welcomed to manhood in the bar mitzvah. Such human details are irrelevant to the Nazi project. And this inevitable blindness of the modern Gestell is what makes sense of Hannah Arendt's phrase of concerning the banality of evil. For most of the Nazi SS men were, I think, not demonic, not sadistic, not mythically, satanically. They were banal, they were blind, mostly ordinary men who could not see, whose actions were the product of an abstract machine of whose existence they were scarcely aware. The only protection against this horror of das Gestell, of the blindness conferred on us by das Gestell, I believe, is the recovery of the power of everyday language in which people express themselves as fathers, friends, sons, aunts, uncles, and not as proletarians, capitalists, revolutionaries, terrorists. Fathers and sons and mothers and daughters live in concrete specific places like the Navajo Valley. Revolutionaries and counter-revolutionaries live in abstract empty spaces defined by some totalizing Gestalt, and in the end they are both terrorists who in the end they are both terrorists whose antagonistic versions of the Gestalt totally and inevitably at odds with each other. And what comes out of their confrontation is the terror with which the rest of us must live. Thus we have Northern Ireland, Lebanon, West Bank, Burundi, Ethiopia, El Salvador, Cambodia, Nicaragua, North Korea. People who used to be simply mortal enemies are now empowered by their totalizing Gestalt to engineer each other out of existence. And so it seems to me we are surrounded by holocausts waiting to be born. Good, well-meaning people are chomping at the bit, eager to empower by their Gestalt, eager like engineers in the Navajo Valley to eradicate whatever is in the way of their project. 1 million or so middle-class Cambodians disappear and no one says a word. 19,000 Mosquito Indians are uprooted from their ancestral lands, and Daniel Ortega says, oops, and everything is okay. Another 5,000 Tutsi tribesmen die killing each other in Burundi, and where is the moral outrage? All these utopian monsters are born from the Gestalt, and so it goes on and on. So what do we have as bulwarks against these depredations of das Gestell, against the depredations of a language that first degrades the human into abstract categories in order to destroy and reshape it into its abstract lifeless designs? What we have is memory. Memory that will teach us to respect the concrete specificity of a language, in which personal names like Adam, Werner, rather than abstract categories like Jew, Aryan, and class enemy dominate. It is very easy, I think, to kill an abstraction, and very difficult, I hope, to kill a human being whose first-person singular existence bears a name and has a history, a lot like ours. After Treblinka, after Auschwitz and Sobibor, we must all show great respect for the everyday speech in which we take up the discussion of good and evil. And this means also that we must say the word Holocaust softly, use it carefully, for it too is a concrete historical happening and not at all abstract. The name Holocaust then must stand for something other than a rhetorical excuse to vent our angst about the state of some particular part of the political world. The concept of a Holocaust, the paradigm of evil, will be irretrievably lost to us if we allow it to be debased into a moral token we wheel out when we want to vent our political enthusiasms. In such a case, the concept of the Holocaust itself will have been captured by das Gestell, will have become one more empty, abstract token in the moves of international politics. But the thing about the Holocaust is that it happened. It occurred as an event, primarily as an event in the history of two peoples, the Jews and the Germans, both of which it almost destroyed. There is then nothing at all abstract about the Holocaust. Careful preservation of the memory of the Holocaust in all its awfulness is one way we can protect ourselves from ourselves. This means we must at least be able to protect the memory of the Holocaust from its conceptual degradation in our time. We must ensure that its trivialization does not become part of the general assault on the sacredness of those everyday languages in which we first come to form understandings of ourselves and everything around us. After all, in a time when people say, I'm dying, when they mean I have a headache, and when they say I'm starving, when they're a little hungry, the destruction of language ties to something larger and richer than itself is well underway. This helter-skelter, pell-mell dash towards the destruction of everyday language, towards its metamorphosis into a meaningless rhetorical device, is one of the first signs of our Gestell, which first must destroy that which it would supplant. When everyday language itself becomes empty, someone will surely step into the breach that it covered the Japanese as honorary Aryans. All of this, of course, is travesty, but it is deadly travesty. And it is perhaps only the rock-hard memorial recall of the Holocaust that will save us from a similar complicity in the destruction of moral language and from a similar destruction of ourselves. This is the end of Harold's paper. Yeah. Yeah. Now, I will attempt, if some of you have a particular question, I might be able to answer it, or maybe not. Maybe I have to refer it to him. But yes.
The question about the incident on the train that you were talking about, I think it passed by very quickly. I'm not sure that's understood what you were saying. Could you repeat that?
Okay. You know, as I recall it from the paper, he was sitting in a train compartment with a German couple, and the German couple apparently the man wanted to say something to him, and he didn't know quite what it was, and then just towards the end he said, "Well, let me tell you, you Americans are so mighty high, but."
Obviously, like Hitler and the others who have, those abused children or whatever, they have some ego deficits and self-deficits. And then you've got science, which the paradox is that it's an ideology that can be made concrete. When, they can use this technology to gain power. So you have these people of, not real mature egos with all this power at their disposal. And throughout history, what you see is the lust for power. Even in primitive times, people used this to protect, to started out to protect agriculture, right? But
yeah.
Like the Huns taking over, right?
Well, surely there's been aggression, but it's sort of interesting. I mean, if you listen to yourself, you talk about you talk about Nazis, but then very soon you slip into a language about ego deficit, immaturity, which are already part of this language machine. That now, because now you've got something to do. You've got an ego deficit. Well, let's go to the store, get some ego, and then supply the deficit or whatever. But you get already a kind of. You're no longer talking about enigmatic evil that is as old as mankind. But you don't have. You see, whenever we talk about evil, we can point to certain stories. We can go to the Old Testament. We can go to the Greeks, etc. But we won't set. But after all, we remain stumped by that, as we ultimately remain stumped about ourselves, which is probably the right way to be, if you talk about human beings. The moment when you talk about ego deficits and something, or having a screw loose or something, could think about a screw, put it in. If you start talking about, instead of evil, something like this, you already move into a technological language that sets out a kind of a stage for some kind of remedial activity. Whereas really, ordinary language is more modest and more to the point. I think that's the notion, that this technical language gives us this kind of strange kind of hubris, as if we could do something where we are really powerless. Of course, psychology is a marvelous example of it, because it talks with great ease about those things. It knows as much about these things as your grocer. I mean, a man who's never studied in his life before. What does a psychologist know about the Nazi crime? I mean, nothing. Yes.
In all the things that we heard in this very, very beautifully written description,
one thing wasn't mentioned, and what comes to mind is when I lived in Germany before I was fortunate enough to leave, I lived with a man who, what the Nazis was an Aryan. He was over the plenipotentiary that took over the family business in Granny. And he constantly spoke of the Nazis, and I think this can be applied equally to the Ayatollah Khomeini, can look at ourselves with a little bit more of a sense of humility, if you will.
Right.
Then we no longer can be these people that are that judgmental, that we take a certain group of people and dehumanize them.
That's right. And of course, at the same time, it takes some of the wind out of the sails with these great plans we have for reforming the world. you know, it forces in a very different kind of frame. Huh? Of course.
And I'm wondering, what's the connection between having such a totalistic worldview and having to compensate by using so much euphemism for what they're actually doing?
Well, give an example. Maybe that would make it...
I was thinking like the neutralization of the village.
Yes. Yes? Yeah. Well, the euphemisms are, nuschen, etc. It is, you see, immediately it puts you on the thing that you can neutralize. There is a neutralization machine that's over there. You get the neutralization machine, Jack. And so, you know, it follows that there is now a total adequacy to the situation. Huh? It is always, invariably, this is a technical language. It's a technical language. This is which speaks about you know, an expertise that we more and more now start seeing from totalitarian, of course, doesn't exist. And of course, it doesn't exist in the social sciences either, but we'll talk about that another time. But these kind of, it gives, this kind of language gives you a kind of an illusion of total power, which isn't there. Yeah, go ahead.
It has to do with, well, one issue here that I think is having to do with the relation between philosophy and the Nazis and the Holocaust, which has remained incredibly silent in Harold's paper. And I think the best way, I could talk about this for too long, but I think the best way to preface it and to introduce it is probably to take issue with Harold that I don't think philosophy is done in oral discourse. I think it's done in writing. And
that philosophy has no what?
That it's not done in oral, what does it call it? The domain of philosophy is not the spoken word, but I think it finds that it's the written text. And the text I want to refer to is a text by Jacques Derrida called Memories, which is about Paul de Man, written as a memoir to him after he died, which I think very recently, a year and a half ago, it came to the attention of the community of the philosophical world, the criticism world, that de Man had written for a Nazi in Belgium in the early days of Europe. This came to the attention of Derrida and a number of other people at Yale, which was extremely disturbing, especially the friendship between these two men, and that this was a secret in de Man's background.
Yeah.
And this came at a point immediately following revelations about Heidegger's relationship with the Nazis, the extent of the complicity with the Nazi Party in Germany. It became a big issue in France. Derrida has written a book that I think is due out in translation this year on this issue. And a number of people in the philosophical community have been writing about this for a number of years. Derrida, in fact, has been, until a couple of years ago, was teaching, I think, for about 3 years on the Holocaust. And there's no mention of this. There's no mention of the extent. I mean, here I have a sense that Harold and Heidegger has been framed himself.
Okay, let me...
the big hole in being as impactful in the question of sociality.
Well...
the dialogue between Heidegger and Levinas and Heidegger.
Well...
I think that needs to be spoken to. It hasn't been. It's conspicuously silent, shall we say, in Heideggerian terms.
Well, that's, you know... let me say in defense of Harold, Harold can't say everything. You know, this was not really, you know, it is, no, but about the paper. I mean, obviously he can't say everything, and he can't, you know, this is not really a paper about Heidegger. I think that it will somehow modulate this kind of whole debate about de Man and about Heidegger, to look at it in terms of language. we're all seduced in some sense by this language. Huh? And it is, the problem is not that the man for a while wrote, it's understandable how many of us might buy this. I mean, you know, put yourself in this position. Huh? So that's not really the question. I think the question is. Pardon?
I mean, I'm not drawing conclusions from this. I'm just simply pointing it out. I think that these issues are going on in the journals. You know, Derrida has a 60-page response in Critical Inquiry, which everybody can read.
Yeah.
She tries to sort this out.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think one has to sort this out.
Yeah,
Talking about the relationship between philosophy and historical tradition.
Yeah.
And shouldn't our models be those philosophers?
Well, no, no, I don't think so. The best here is people who are seduced and recoup in some way. There is, you see, if you look on the level of this paper, I can only speak about the level of this paper. It cuts underneath such notions as you have to become a party member, or you have to write in the wrong kind of newspaper, or you know, you have to do any of the things in order to be part of something rather destructive. That we even today in our everyday very fine sort of very acceptable sort of academic life, that we can be very well guilty of it without that we mustn't seek necessarily the evil in party membership or in some kind of a thing, but must see it really in our being seduced by a kind of language that seduces us into that a language beside any possibility of talking about morality or about human beings.
But that's the point I'm raising. Isn't Heidegger's language just that kind of a language?
Well, I don't know. You want to raise the question whether Heidegger's language is what now?
It's just that kind of language that leads discourse away from ethics. That's Levinas' challenge to Heidegger.
Yeah, well, that's not how I see it, but it may be possible. It seems to me clearly that Heidegger, whoever Heidegger was, but I mean, if you look at the text, it leads us back towards poetry and towards the richness of everyday life and back to our Greek roots and so forth. Huh? That leads us back into the pulp of language, and that it doesn't lead us towards saving concepts. Huh? And I think in that sense, it's very interesting. I mean, whoever wrote it, I mean, whatever party membership may have been involved of this.
It's a very concrete thing to them, you know, the flag and democracy and all this.
Yeah.
And I think we're all being seduced by that.
Okay, yes?
In the manuscript, you talked about, you gave the analogy between the Navajo Indians, or the Indians
The valley.
who had more of a, you want to call it like a whitehead outlook
Yeah.
in their valley, everything.
Yeah.
But they're complex. And the engineer who walks in and knows his goals.
Yeah.
You were talking about the mechanisms involved, that he
Right.
had certain mechanisms. Are these mechanisms in society, are they the ideas of professionalism?
Yeah.
Institutions such as political institutions, economic institutions, where we try and become so singularly focused that we
Yeah.
almost invent a new type of language to try and express our own individuality.
Well, the paper makes the point that the difference between the engineer and the Navajo is not something about character. It's not that one is a good man, the other one a bad man. It's not. You know, it's not on that level. It is just simply that that the engineer has a particular, that he lives within a particular kind of abstract linguistic scheme, and that he has impoverished his language so as to only live within this particular technical language, which he thinks will give him the clue to to the real reality that is there. And that he, of course, recognizes when he gets a cup of coffee from a waitress and so forth, he knows how to say common things. But now that kind of language, that language is just simply just a kind of poetic nonsense. It's not really serious. But that when he looks at the valley through the language that is that of his profession, then he gets to the real nitty-gritty and the real things. So it is really basically his preference. Is actually, see, there's not even anything, according to the paper, there's not even anything wrong with engineering language per se. There's nothing wrong with it. as long as one knows that that is not some kind of ultimate which we can then finally rest, but that we have to come back from the language of engineering to go back into this other language when we talk about human concerns, and to keep that alive. Yeah? So that that the specialist language doesn't swallow up the whole language. That's totalitarianism. Yes?
Well, I mean, if an engineer or someone with medical knowledge or whatever was concerned about ethics and they were doing things to help them out of those,
Right.
then they, you know, it wouldn't matter about the object or intersubjectivity or whatever they use, whatever technical skills they use to help those people. If they had a concern for human beings, the language, they could talk the language amongst themselves, but if they had that concern, they could still use scientific knowledge in a human way. Because, you know, scientific knowledge has been used in for good or for evil.
Yeah. It is just a question of that it isn't an absolute or ultimate language, that we all scientific language have to return to an everyday language in order to reach each other, and that in valuing ordinary language we make possible a moral world. In destroying it, we destroy the moral world. I think that's the point. Yes.
How do you, there's a lot I really find interesting, and I appreciate these distinctions, but how do you account for domestic violence where children, where fathers and mothers harm their children using every day in their own homes? How does this fit in?
Well, here you would have to, you certainly would have to relate domestic violence, the disintegration of family life in the West, although now I think it is building up again. But we certainly must make, this is not on Harold's responsibility, this is on, we certainly must look, we must make a connection between the degradation of the family and the technical language which has been invented by psychologists, sociologists, and social workers who use and who constantly think that they can interfere with the language, that they can interfere with this because they have a powerful language. They come in there and they use a certain set of language. We talk at the university not about family language. It's all coined in engineering terms, but like what one does about it. And that all the strategies of the government towards families is all based on this kind of technological language, like you're going to take care of things. You always have a bunch of experts who are going to take care of things. And the more experts you have, the more misery you get. It's just simply like that,
Well, it's because we have conservative policymakers in the government. We don't know what to do. We have beautiful ideas about how to integrate fragmented services and how to deal with human beings. But we can't implement the practice, and we don't have the resources because we have conservative policymakers who cut back the money. So it doesn't have anything to do with ideas, because we've got great ideas.
The biggest question of ideas, yes.
Is the movement back towards a more language, a more humanistic use of language?
Oh, watch out. Yes.
Well, I won't define it anymore.
Okay.
It seems to me that as language is a very individual thing, oftentimes that change in that movement is done on an individual level. I'm wondering, is there more than that? Is there another way to make that movement besides in our own communications and the way we write and speak?
A movement? What kind of movement are you thinking about?
Well, Alderman's paper talks about the use of language.
Right.
And getting back to a more moral.
Right.
A more moral language.
Right.
And
I see.
Is that only done on an individual level? It seems to me, or are there other ways?
Well, hopefully also at an institutional level. It means that individually in our families, it means in our university that we come to honor ordinary language with all its depth and its mystery. That, in other words, we allow ourselves to be guided by language rather than to superimpose, to use language as a tool with which we can affect our particular kind of means. It's a different use. It's a shift in the use of language. To abstain from this hubris, I think. Yeah. Yeah, does that answer your question? So it's a question also in terms of institutions. It's perfectly all right for us to coin all sorts of terms and to have all kinds of technical terms, because we can't really quite do without technical terms and definitions. But to always know that the final decisions have to always be made in, the final understanding always has to be made in ordinary language and not in these technical abstract things. That there is no than any kind of language of psychologists or social workers or philosophers. Huh? Exactly. Right. To speak plainly and to live, always make decisions in the plain, in that plain sight. I'm hoping I'm not doing him injustice. Yes.
This brings up an issue that I felt in this class, is having lived in Germany and lived around Germans. In this class, I think too many times the word German gets used in the context where where it's really meant to mean Nazi, because not all the Germans were Nazis, and
Right.
And not all Nazis were Germans. And I think that it's too easy to get caught in the context of that and to just relate Germans, as a group. Because I lived in Germany between the years of 82 and 85.
Right.
And I don't really know the Germans that are brought up in this class.
Yeah.
I see some Nazis in Germany. I think that does happen, and it's an issue that it is confusing and it can be distressful.
Right. Right. Yeah, I think Harold makes the distinction, when he quotes Bettelheim, which was a very nice quote. Yes, I think this, to talk about, to talk about guilt and so forth is to invoke essentially a kind of a Nazi ideology.
May I say something to
Please.
this young man? If what he mentioned previously were used instead of talking about a group, Germans, we say, well, Hans is nice and Franz is nice, Gustav is nice, but Peter is the son of a gun, Then we have a little bit more realistic picture.
Right.
It's people, persons, not, let's not think in terms of groups.
Right. Yes.
So, is there then something suspect about the whole concept of national personality?
Yes.
Talk about the Germans. This is frequently a topic in these discussions. The German people,
Oh, yeah.
or the Italians. Then the question comes around: is there an American personality? And the question kind of breaks up because of the supposed pluralism of our society. But I think I've got several times.
Yes, I think there's lots get lost if you do that. Yes.
I'm glad that moral concerns are getting so popular. I'm also very troubled, but moral concerns mean moral judgment, and I don't see any great stampede to make those judgments.
Yeah.
In many situations, because they involve judgments which would disturb the present equilibrium. The sense of egalitarianism is violated, and if these moral judgments are made, there are going to be some, quote, better or worse. And in the sense that you defined of reaching toward defined goals, the illusion of the happiness is that everybody marches toward those goals and we don't have to make any judgments. I'm even troubled by the use of the model of the engineer as our scapegoat here this afternoon.
Yes. Yeah.
To believe that there are human beings who have no perceptions of either beauty or desirable place to live, simply because they practice engineering is professional imagination.
Right.
We've all cursed them when we work on our projects. I've done my share. But nevertheless, we have to find a better way of solving human problems than putting others down, however noble.
I think that the engineers here is here used as a figure of speech. I think it is it's important. I mean, it's not even we don't need to take away from him that he that he sees the beauty. The problem, I think, as Harold sees it here, is the kind of value that somebody would put to his engineering observations and other kind of observations that he might have, that he might tell his grandchildren about, or he'd tell his wife about at night, that he puts them in a category as if they are somehow less real, less dependable, less vital to living in some way. Huh? I think that obviously there's no problem with engineering if all the decisions are made in everyday language. Huh? Yeah.
I'm curious about what other people think of the notion of collective responsibility, because I think we ought to be thinking more about group responsibility and not so much about, not that we should ignore individual responsibility, but it seems to me that many times when something happens, like if you have, if you on your street that somebody is abusing their children or something like that, and you don't do anything about it, you don't even invite the child over to your house or anything to try to help minimize the situation, you're of course not responsible in the same way that the parent or grandparent or uncle or step-parent or whoever it is responsible.
Yeah.
And yet I think it's very significant.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that many of the awful happen in our society happen in large part because many of us turn our faces the other way, or in some way don't attend to what's going on. And I really think we need to pay more attention to that. And whether we call that group or collective responsibility, it's not that I want to pin that name on that activity, but I think that activity needs to be called attention to.
Well, it's certainly true that, but to despise somebody because they come from Washington, or to despise somebody, as recently happened during a professional meeting, just to barge into somebody's meeting and to break up his meeting because the man happens to be a South African, and so they just all booted him out. Just for nothing. Nobody ever knew whether this man has done anything in his life, but everybody very righteously just got him out of there. This is the kind of mentality I think that is very, very dangerous. And I think at least that is like one sort of thing that we can learn from this experience. Yeah.
But also with collective blame.
Yeah.
Many times, if we look for that, we have a tendency to put that on the people who supposedly did it, but yet it doesn't stay within the generation. It transcends time.
Mm-hmm.
So that many people who are, say, of German background,
Mm-hmm.
who are not even born, are being persecuted in other people's minds for doing the act that maybe their grandparents did. And so that's, at that point there we have to be careful in where we say the crime was committed.
Right.
If we say it was a social crime, then it's the old thing on the baseball team. If we lose the game, everybody's responsible. So if we're all responsible, then it means the human crime is responsible.
Right.
Maybe at that point collectively, but it just doesn't seem though if we look for this collective idea that it will only stop in 1945, that it will constantly keep going. And how do you explain to a culture or somebody that something happened in their culture and that they will constantly be paying?
Thank you very much. That was excellent. I enjoyed it very much.
All right. Yeah, let me shake your hand.
And you also reminded me, well, we ought to get a picture.